There is a particular kind of evil that is almost impossible to detect until it is far too late. It does not lurk in abandoned buildings or dark alleyways. It does not look dangerous from the outside. It smiles at your children in the afternoon sunlight. It waves to your neighbors. It sits comfortably in a lawn chair on a friend's porch and watches. It learns. It waits. And when the entire world around it finally falls asleep, it moves. On the night of July the 10th, 2007, that particular kind of evil moved through a quiet family apartment complex in North Charleston, South Carolina, and by the time the sun came up the next morning, a devoted, hardworking mother was dead, her 20-year-old son was dead, and a 14-year-old little girl who had spent her final hours excitedly dreaming about a new pair of yellow shoes and her first year of high school was gone forever. But here is the part of this story that will stay with you long after this video ends. That same 14-year-old girl, in the most terrifying moment any human being can possibly imagine, made a decision so brave, so selfless, and so extraordinary that it left hardened homicide detectives standing speechless in a muddy field at sunrise. She had every reason in the world to think only of herself. She chose something else entirely. That is the story we are telling today on True Crime Web. Welcome back to True Crime Web, the channel committed to honoring victims, exposing the truth, and making sure the names of the innocent are never, ever forgotten. If you are new here, please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop the time you are watching this video in the comments below. We love knowing when our True Crime Web family are mostly active. Now, let us take you back to the night that shattered an entire community and revealed a monster hiding in plain sight. It was 2:24 in the morning on July the 10th, 2007. A heavy, suffocating summer heat hung over the Archdale Forest apartment complex in North Charleston, South Carolina, the kind of heat that makes the air feel thick and close, even in the middle of the night. The community was completely asleep. Archdale Forest was a safe, quiet neighborhood. Families lived there. Neighbors looked out for one another. Children played outside until the streetlights flickered on in the evenings. It was exactly the kind of place where people put down roots because they felt protected. Nobody inside those apartment buildings had any reason to believe that the peace they trusted so completely was about to be shattered forever. Then, without any warning, a sharp, violent noise cracked through the dark summer air. Residents described it as sounding like a loud firework at first, the kind of sudden pop that makes you flinch and then relax almost immediately. But what followed next left absolutely no room for confusion. A woman's voice cried out in pure, unfiltered terror. It was a scream that carried the full weight of desperation, a sound so raw and so desperate that it pulled sleeping people straight out of their beds. 3 more rapid gunshots followed immediately after, their hard, flat cracks bouncing off the brick walls of the apartment buildings and rolling across the dark grounds. Residents woke up in full panic. Most of them stayed frozen in their beds, too frightened to even approach their own windows. But 2 neighbors reached for their phones and dialed 911. One reported hearing gunshots directly behind his building. Another described a violent disturbance happening just outside her front door. The dispatcher immediately sent multiple units racing toward Archdale Forest. The nightmare had officially begun. Dorchester County Sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes. They rolled slowly onto Shagbark Trail with their headlights dimmed, scanning the shadows between the buildings, watching the tree lines at the edges of the property, checking for any movement, any figure fleeing into the dark. They did not know whether an active shooter was still walking the grounds. The entire complex sat in an eerie, unnatural silence, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The officers parked their cruisers, drew their weapons, and began moving carefully on foot. They approached Building 213, and that is when one of the first officers noticed something deeply wrong. The front door to apartment 213B was standing completely wide open. Warm yellow light spilled out through the open doorway and spread across the dark concrete walkway outside. The officers stacked up at the entrance and announced their presence loudly and clearly. No answer came back. The apartment was perfectly, terrifyingly silent. They crossed the threshold slowly, swept into the living room, and walked directly into a massacre. The air inside was heavy with the sharp, acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. The apartment was narrow. A staircase sat immediately to the left. A kitchen and a small living area opened up to the right. The very first thing the officers saw when they entered was a woman lying completely motionless on the floor. Her name was Diane Grant. She was 44 years old. She was a hard-working, devoted single mother who had spent her entire adult life building a safe and loving home for her children. Now that life was gone. Diane had suffered massive trauma to the back of her head. She had been shot at point-blank range. A bullet had passed completely through her cheek and driven itself into a nearby wall. Blood had pooled across the floor around her. The officers kept moving. They swept their flashlights deeper into the room. Just a few short steps from where Diane lay, they discovered a second victim. A young man was lying near the couch, half on his stomach, completely still. This was 20-year-old Jatavius DeVore, Diane's son. He had been violently shot below his eye and had suffered severe blunt force trauma to his scalp. The officers checked both victims for any signs of life. There were none. It was a brutal double homicide, carried out with extreme, calculated violence. And yet nothing in the apartment had been stolen. The television was still sitting on its stand. Valuables were completely untouched. This was not a burglary that spiraled out of control. This was a targeted, deliberate execution. The bottom floor was clear, but the officers knew this was a family home. They looked up the dark staircase with their weapons drawn and their flashlights cutting through the shadows. They climbed slowly, step by step, fully prepared to encounter an armed killer waiting somewhere in the darkness above them. They reached the second floor and pushed open the first bedroom door. Their flashlights swept the room, and instead of finding more horror, they found something that stopped their hearts for an entirely different reason. 2 small children were fast asleep inside that room. A 5-year-old little girl was tucked safely into her bed. An 18-month-old baby boy was resting quietly inside a crib. They were Diane's grandchildren. They were completely and miraculously unharmed. Those 2 precious babies had slept right through the horrific murders happening directly below them. Officers moved quickly and gently. They carried the sleeping children out of the apartment and transferred them into the careful hands of paramedics waiting safely outside. The children were alive. They were safe. But the officers' relief lasted only a matter of seconds. When the detectives began reviewing the personal documents and mail sitting on a table downstairs, they discovered a critical detail. Another person lived in this apartment. Her name was Deanna DeVore. She was Diane's 14-year-old daughter. The officers returned upstairs and searched every room. They checked inside closets. They looked under beds. They examined every bathroom. They found Deanna's bedroom. Her personal belongings were there. Her bed was empty. The front door was still standing wide open. A massive cold knot formed in the stomach of every officer on that scene. Where was the 14-year-old girl? The possibilities were terrifying. Had the killer taken her as a hostage? Had she managed to run from the building during the shooting? One of the 911 callers had clearly reported hearing a woman scream outside the apartment before the final gunshots rang out. The detectives understood with growing dread that this nightmare might not be confined to the walls of apartment 213B. A violent killer was loose somewhere in the dark, and a young teenage girl was unaccounted for. The police immediately declared an emergency and expanded the search across the entire complex. The clock was ticking and every second mattered. Officers fanned out in every direction. They knocked on doors. They woke confused and frightened neighbors. They asked if anyone had seen a young girl running. They checked behind parked cars and searched the tree lines at the edges of the property with powerful flashlights. They prayed silently that Deanna was simply hiding somewhere, too terrified to make a sound, waiting to be found. The dark sky slowly turned gray as the hours passed. The summer sun finally climbed above the horizon and bathed the complex in morning light that felt deeply wrong, given what the night had already brought. And then, at approximately 6:30 in the morning, 2 detectives walking behind Building 105 made a discovery that broke every heart on that scene. Building 105 was separated from the DeVore family's apartment by a road and a small ravine. It was a significant distance away. The detectives looked down at the muddy ground near an electrical utility box, and there she was. 14-year-old Deanna DeVore was lying on her side in the wet grass. The double homicide was now, officially, a triple homicide. The scene around Deanna told a story of absolute horror. She was partially unclothed. Her pajama bottoms and underwear had been placed on top of the nearby electrical box. She was completely barefoot. She had been shot at least 4 times at very close range. The bullets had struck her face, her neck, her back, and her shoulder. The physical evidence at the scene pointed strongly toward a sexual assault having taken place before she was murdered. A monster had chased a terrified teenage girl through the dark, cornered her far from her home, and gunned her down in the mud. Then he walked away and left her there. Before we go any further into this investigation, we have to stop and talk about who these 3 people actually were. Because Diane Grant, Jatavius DeVore, and Deanna DeVore were not simply names typed onto a police report. They were deeply, profoundly loved human beings whose absence left a wound in their community that will never fully heal. Diane Grant was a true force of nature in every sense of the phrase. She was a dedicated, fiercely protective single mother who poured every ounce of her energy into building a good life for her children. She had moved her family to North Charleston just a few years before the murders specifically, because she wanted better schools for her kids and better opportunities for their futures. She worked long, exhausting shifts at a local manufacturing plant. There were stretches of time where she worked 2 jobs simultaneously just to make ends meet. Despite everything, she kept a beautiful, clean home. Everyone who knew her described her grace and her quiet elegance. She was the absolute rock of her entire family, the person everyone leaned on, the person who made everything work. She deserved decades more of life, of watching her children grow, of holding her grandchildren, of simply resting after a lifetime of hard work. Jatavius DeVore was 20 years old. He was the protective older brother, the kind of young man who made people feel better just by being in the room. His neighbors at the apartment complex remembered him as a friendly, warm, genuinely funny guy who had a natural gift for making people laugh. He was loyal to his mother and his sister in a way that defined him as a person. He had come home to visit his family for the summer. He was just stepping into his adult life, full of potential and possibility, with so much road still ahead of him. And then there was Deanna. She was the youngest, the baby of the family, a bright and outgoing and wonderfully chatty teenager who made friends everywhere she went. She loved fashion. She loved shoes. In the hours before the murders took place, her mother had gone out and bought her a pair of bright yellow high heels for the upcoming school year. Deanna was so excited about starting high school. She wanted to make her family proud. She was weeks away from her 15th birthday. This family had done absolutely nothing to deserve what happened to them. They harmed no one. They worked hard. They loved each other completely. The violence that tore them apart was senseless and catastrophic in the deepest possible way. Now we need to talk about something that the investigators discovered when they studied the full crime scene and the physical evidence left behind at Deanna's location. Because the position of her body, the direction of the footprints in the mud, and the distance between her and her own apartment told a story that was not just heartbreaking. It was extraordinary. When Deanna ran out of that apartment, she did not simply flee blindly in the first direction available to her. She made a decision, a deliberate, conscious, protective decision. Think about what she knew in that moment. She had just watched a monster murder her mother and her brother inside her own living room. She had been attacked herself. She was barefoot, partially unclothed, absolutely terrified and running for her life in the pitch black. But she also knew something else. She knew that her 5-year-old niece and her 18-month-old nephew were sleeping upstairs. And she understood, with a clarity that staggers the imagination, exactly what the killer would do if she stayed close to the building or screamed for help right outside the front door. He would hear the babies. He would find them. So Deanna DeVore ran in the opposite direction. She sprinted across the grass, across the road, across the ravine, putting as much distance as she could between that monster and those 2 sleeping children. She forced him to follow her. She led him away from the apartment. She drew the danger away from the only people left who still needed protecting. She sacrificed her own life, knowingly and bravely, so that a 5-year-old girl and an 18-month-old baby boy would wake up the next morning. And they did wake up. They are alive today because of what Deanna DeVore chose to do in the darkest, most terrifying moment a 14-year-old child has ever been asked to face. If that is not the purest definition of a hero, then the word has no meaning at all. If you are finding this story as powerful as we do here at True Crime Web, please tap the like button right now. It genuinely helps us reach more viewers and keeps us able to bring these important stories to light. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it now. Every subscriber helps us honor victims like Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna. The forensics team moved into apartment 213B with full protective gear and the focused intensity of investigators who understood the weight of what they were being asked to solve. They started at the front door, and the very first detail they documented stopped them cold. There was absolutely no sign of forced entry. The door frame was completely intact. The deadbolt showed no damage. The wooden edges were not splintered in any way. This meant one thing with certainty. The killer did not break into this family's home. He either walked through a door that was unlocked, or Deanna herself opened it for him, possibly because she recognized him or was manipulated into letting him inside. That detail alone told investigators a great deal about the nature of this crime. Moving deeper into the apartment, the technicians recovered 2 brass shell casings near the kitchen counter. Outside in the mud, near where Deanna's body was found, they recovered 4 more. All 6 casings were a perfect match. They were .40 caliber Smith & Wesson ammunition. The investigators also noticed fresh dirt on the floor near the kitchen and dining area, tracking left behind by someone moving through the apartment from outside. They used specialized forensic gel pads, pressing the adhesive film carefully over the dirt to lift clean shoe impressions directly from the floorboards. The tread pattern was distinctive, circular markings on both the ball and the heel of the shoe. The forensic team identified the brand immediately. The killer had been wearing Nike Air Force One sneakers. The print matched a men's size 10. The medical examiner also collected crucial DNA evidence during the post-mortem examination of the victims, gathering genetic material that would ultimately become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. The 6 shell casings were sent to the State Law Enforcement Division for ballistics analysis. Forensics experts examined the microscopic markings left on each casing by the firing pin of the gun that discharged them. Every semi-automatic firearm in the world leaves a unique microscopic signature on the casings it produces, as individual and unrepeatable as a human fingerprint. The experts photographed those markings in high resolution and uploaded the images into a national ballistics database. The result that came back was explosive. The same gun used to murder Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna had been used in 2 other local shootings that were already sitting in police files as unsolved cold cases. The first was a shooting at a local establishment called the Anchor Bar, which had occurred 4 months earlier. The second was a drive-by shooting at the Hunter Ridge apartment complex. Nobody had died in either of those previous incidents, but the ballistic match meant something enormous. The same weapon tied all 3 crime scenes together, and that meant the killer had a history in the local criminal landscape that investigators could now trace directly. Detectives pulled the cold case files for the Hunter Ridge drive-by shooting and found a critical piece of information already sitting inside them. A man had previously been arrested in connection with that specific crime. His name was Xavier Walker. Investigators brought Xavier in for questioning about the DeVore murders. He denied everything. He claimed to have no connection to the dead family whatsoever. But when the detectives made clear to him that the murder weapon directly linked him to a brutal triple homicide, Xavier Walker understood that his options had narrowed dramatically. He agreed to cooperate. In exchange for the dropping of his own weapons charges, he told investigators exactly who had been holding the .40 caliber handgun during the drive-by shootings. The name he gave them was Anthony Sanders. The detectives ran Anthony Sanders through their criminal database immediately. What they found painted the picture of a man with a long and serious history of dangerous behavior. Anthony Sanders was 25 years old. He had grown up in the Charleston area. His record included charges for drug distribution, including selling near a school zone, multiple convictions for assault, and a well-documented pattern of heavy drug and alcohol use. He was known to carry weapons. He was a man with demonstrated capacity for violence. The hunt shifted entirely to Anthony Sanders. The investigators had a suspect, but they still faced a critical question that any good defense attorney would raise immediately in court. Why? Why would this man target this specific family, in this specific apartment, on this specific night? The detectives dug into Anthony's personal life, tracking his daily movements and looking for any hidden thread connecting him to the DeVores. What they found was chilling in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Anthony Sanders had a girlfriend of more than 3 years. Her name was Media. She cooperated fully with the investigators. She confirmed the relationship and provided her home address. The detectives looked at the address she gave them and felt the temperature in the room drop. Media lived inside the Archdale Forest apartment complex, not just in the same general area. She lived in Building 105, the exact building behind which Deanna DeVore's body had been found lying in the mud. Anthony Sanders had not randomly selected this community off a map. He had been inside this neighborhood repeatedly, consistently, over an extended period of time. He had access to a front-row view of the entire complex through his girlfriend's apartment. He used that access like a hunter uses a blind. Detectives took a photograph of Anthony Sanders and returned to the Archdale Forest complex. They showed his face to residents throughout the community. The recognition was immediate and consistent. Neighbor after neighbor confirmed they had seen Anthony hanging around the common areas in the weeks leading up to the murders, and several of them provided a detail that made detectives' blood run cold. They had specifically seen Anthony speaking directly with Deanna DeVore on multiple occasions. He was not simply visiting his girlfriend and minding his business. He was watching. He was learning. He was grooming his target, learning her routines, identifying her vulnerabilities and mapping out exactly which apartment she lived in and exactly when she would be there. On the night of the murders, Anthony had visited his girlfriend and reportedly left her apartment around 10 o'clock in the evening. But he did not go home. He stayed in the dark somewhere on those grounds, and he waited for the complex to fall completely and deeply asleep. The investigators secured a search warrant for Anthony Sanders' cell phone records, covering the night of July the 9th and the early morning hours of July the 10th. The data they retrieved built a timeline so precise and so damning that it essentially placed Anthony at the scene in digital form, with a clarity that was impossible to argue against. His phone showed consistent activity throughout the early part of the evening, calls made and received in a perfectly normal pattern. But then, at a specific point in the night, his phone went completely silent. No outgoing calls, no incoming responses. A deliberate, unbroken period of digital darkness that aligned perfectly with the window of time during which the murders took place inside apartment 213B. Then, at exactly 2:24 in the morning, Anthony's phone came back to life with an outgoing call. 2:24 in the morning was the precise minute that terrified neighbors were dialing 911 to report the gunshots they had just heard. Anthony Sanders called his girlfriend in the immediate aftermath of the murders. A minute later, he called a second woman. He remained on the phone for 18 minutes. The cell tower data tracking those calls told the rest of the story. During the time of the murders, his phone was pinging off a tower located less than 1 mile from the DeVore apartment. After the gunshots, the pings began moving. His phone hit a tower on Yolanda Drive, then another on Ashley River Road. The digital footprints traced a clear, unmistakable escape route away from the crime scene. He was driving. He was fleeing. He also called a teenage former girlfriend who lived out of state. Witnesses who spoke with her reported that he sounded panicked and desperate. He told her he needed to leave South Carolina immediately. He used a false name during the conversation. He knew exactly what he had done. The police brought Anthony Sanders in on outstanding charges related to the Hunter Ridge drive-by shooting, keeping the triple homicide charges off the table initially so they could observe his behavior in the interrogation room. Anthony walked in wearing handcuffs and wearing his arrogance like a second skin. He sat down at the metal table and leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he was far smarter than everyone in the building. Detective John Garrison led the interview with careful precision. He kept the conversation tightly focused on the drive-by shooting and said nothing about the dead family. He watched Anthony carefully. He probed for cracks. Anthony denied owning any firearms. He lied directly and without any visible hesitation. Detective Garrison eventually decided to change the approach entirely. He leaned across the table and told Anthony plainly that investigators knew what he had done. He told him that the murder weapon connected him directly to 3 homicides, and that without cooperation, he would be formally charged with 3 counts of murder. The smug confidence Anthony had been projecting evaporated in an instant. His expression hardened. He stopped talking. He invoked his right to remain silent and demanded an attorney. The interview ended. The door closed. But the investigation was far from finished. The detectives obtained a search warrant for Anthony's personal residence and moved through it methodically. In the bedroom Anthony shared with his twin brother, they found multiple pairs of Nike Air Force One sneakers. The tread patterns matched perfectly with the shoe impressions lifted from the floor of the DeVore apartment. They also found a shoebox that contained not shoes, but live ammunition. The cartridges were .40 caliber Smith & Wesson rounds, the exact same make and caliber as the casings recovered at both crime scenes. While the search was ongoing, a man named Richard walked voluntarily into the police station and asked to speak with a detective. Richard admitted that he regularly allowed Anthony to borrow his black pickup truck, accepting drugs in exchange for vehicle access. But the reason Richard came in was specific. He told investigators that he kept a personal semi-automatic .40 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun stored inside that truck, along with a can of loose ammunition. Both items had recently gone missing. Richard believed Anthony had taken them. Investigators cross-referenced this information against the evidence photographs already taken from Anthony's bedroom. Sitting in the corner of the room was an ammunition can that matched Richard's description precisely. The connection between Anthony Sanders and the murder weapon was now thoroughly and physically established. But the single most disturbing discovery came from underneath Anthony's bed. The search team found a small, heavy metal safe, locked securely. They forced it open. Inside, they did not find drugs or cash. They found a carefully folded newspaper clipping. The article was dated July the 12th, 2007, and it detailed the murders of Diane Grant, Jatavius DeVore, and Deanna DeVore in full. Anthony Sanders had cut it out and locked it away. He was keeping it as a personal trophy. He was proud of what he had done to that family. He felt no remorse. None at all. The final piece arrived from the forensic laboratory. The DNA profile extracted from the evidence collected from Deanna DeVore was compared against a fresh sample taken from Anthony Sanders. The results were a positive match. The killer's own genetic code placed him at the scene. The trap was shut permanently. The cell phone tower data, the girlfriend's address, the matching ammunition, the stolen weapon connection, the Nike shoe prints, the newspaper trophy, and the DNA evidence combined into a case that left no room for doubt, no room for argument, and no room for escape. Anthony Sanders was formally charged with 3 counts of murder. When the trial date arrived in March of 2010, he made a calculated decision in a last-ditch attempt to save his own life. He waived his right to a jury trial and agreed to a bench trial, meaning a single judge would hear the evidence and determine his fate. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to remove the death penalty from consideration. The victim's family supported this arrangement, not out of mercy for Anthony Sanders, but out of a genuine need to avoid decades of mandatory appeals that would have forced them to relive the nightmare over and over again. They wanted closure. They needed finality. The prosecutor laid out the complete timeline before the judge in precise and unflinching detail. He described how Anthony Sanders had used his girlfriend's apartment as a hunting blind, watching the community, fixating on a 14-year-old girl, and ultimately forcing his way into her home in the middle of the night armed with a stolen weapon. He described how Diane Grant and Jatavius DeVore walked into that living room and stood between the killer and their family. He described how Anthony raised that gun and murdered them both, and how Deanna ran out into the dark and made the choice that saved 2 sleeping children's lives. The judge listened to every word. He reviewed every piece of evidence, and he delivered his verdict without hesitation. Anthony Sanders was found guilty on all 3 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences in prison with absolutely no possibility of parole. He will spend every remaining day of his life inside a concrete cell. He will never hurt another family. He will never walk free. This case leaves us with a lesson that we at True Crime Web believe is worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Predators do not always announce themselves. They do not always look frightening from the outside. Sometimes they sit on a girlfriend's porch in a quiet residential complex and watch children play in the afternoon sun. They learn routines. They identify the vulnerable. They wait. This is why awareness matters. This is why community vigilance matters. This is why we must always pay attention to who is watching our neighborhoods and trust our instincts when something feels wrong. But more than anything else, this story belongs to 3 people who deserved so much more than what the world gave them on that July night. Diane Grant was a woman of grace, strength, and fierce maternal love who worked herself to the bone for her children. She deserved to see them grow. DeVore was a young man just beginning his life, loyal and warm and full of the kind of potential the world can never afford to lose. He deserved decades more of laughter and love. And Deanna DeVore, 14 years old, weeks from her birthday, excited about yellow shoes and high school and everything waiting for her on the other side of that door, she deserved to grow up. She deserved every single tomorrow that was stolen from her. But in the darkest and most terrifying moment of her short life, Deanna made a choice that reveals more about the depth of her character than most people display in a lifetime. She ran away from safety to protect babies who could not protect themselves. She gave everything she had, and because of her, 2 children are alive in this world today. May Diane Grant, DeVore, and Deanna DeVore rest in perfect undisturbed peace. Their names will never be forgotten on this channel. We will always say them out loud. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you why this work matters, please hit the like button right now and leave a comment below telling us what you took away from Deanna's story. Your engagement helps True Crime Web reach more people and keeps these victims' memories alive for the world to hear. And if you are not yet part of our True Crime Web family, please subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you are always the first to know when we release a new video. We work hard to bring you stories that matter, told with the honesty and the respect they deserve. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and we will see you in the next one.